On today's episode of Let's Find a Niche, we have Nina. Nina is one of the better infantry bows that we have in the game, but is overshadowed due to a rarity. And it's not really hard to understand why, considering we have someone like Norn in the pool. Norn is effectively a jack-of-all-trades archer with better access to merges as opposed to Nina. Likewise, unlike Nina, Norn has a defense stat and better HP, meaning she could take on physical threats more often. However, what Norn lacks in comparison is a solid preferred weapon. That being said, on a similar note, we have stuff such as Spendthrift and Plaguean Bow, which means Norn is still in a relatively good spot, all things considered. But even so, Nina's preferred weapon opens up a lot of things to Nina in comparison. But before we get into that, we should at least talk about her stats. Nina comes with a decent amount of res, attack, and speed, but lacks defense and has low HP, meaning it's easy to take her out with any physical damage dealing unit. However, if you do have max merges and max flowers, it can become relatively better. But that being said, it does get carried a lot by her preferred weapon, which is a Slaying Shining Bow that grants Spectrum 6 and heals for every hit, which means Nina can actually become quite an archer thanks to the amount of stats she gets. So with it equipped, she can easily become a really decent mage tank on Aether Raids offense, and her defense stat gets a bit better because of the +6 she gets. Granted, her HP is still low, but if you do account for blessing HP, then she's going to get relatively tankier. However, her best stats are definitely going to be her speed and her resistance, both of which are fantastic stats that you would need for something like Aether Raids offense. Speaking of which, we could go over to two builds that I prepared for Aether Raids offense, those being one for light and then one for dark. For the light build, we have Spy Song Bow with Iceberg, Mirror Stance 3, Null Counter Disrupt, Attack Smoke, and Speed Res Solo. The reason we're running something like this on light is because we want to take full advantage of her res stat, which is why we have something like Mirror Stance 3 and Speed Res Solo. She will get enough attack through her weapon, as it grants an additional 6 to her attack, speed, defense, and resistance. Likewise, because she has healing on every hit, she doesn't have to run something like Noontime or Soul, even though she can. She can run something like Iceberg for more damage output, and because she is relatively fast, you don't have to really worry about taking all too much damage, unless it's against units that can have a forced follow-up. However, because your resistance stat is going to be more important in something like Aether Raids offense, you can stack that up really high and take even less damage from mages and magic allies. So in this instance, we turn her into a Null Counter Disrupt tank, which she can do very well, thanks to the fact that she has a really good res stat. So starting out with a base of 38 res, assuming max merges and max flowers, Spy Song Bow granting another 6, Mirror Stance 3 granting another additional 6, and Guard, which means you could slow down the special of the foe, and then an additional speed res solo on her seal. She can easily reach upwards of 56 resistance before any sort of blessings and visible stat buffs, which is fantastic for mage tanking. She doesn't really need something like Null Follow-Up for this build because a lot of the time she's going to be outspeeding naturally. However, the issue you may run into is enemies with impacts and enemies with guaranteed follow-ups. Those you won't be able to prevent, but I do think for something on light, you can easily run Null Counter Disrupt and get away with a lot. Just be sure that if you do run into units that have impact skills, such as Bramyman for example, that you have the ability to take on the hits, because chances are he's going to be doubling anyway because of how fast Nina is, unless you run Null Follow-Up. But because her resistance is relatively high, you don't have to worry about him doing all too much damage. And then we have a build for Astra. We still have her preferred weapon, Iceberg, but this time we have Close Foil, Null Follow-Up, Pulse Smoke, and Attack Speed Solo. One of the problems on Astra is we don't have a resistance mythic. We only have a bunch of attack ones and defense and speed. But because Nina has relatively high res at her base anyway, she's not going to be suffering as much as somebody else would, so you can afford to run something like Null Follow-Up against mages, guaranteed follow-ups, so on and so forth. The only thing you may have to worry about is physical damage, because that's going to be a problem nonetheless. So this is why we have something like Close Foil with Spy Song Bow. Close Foil will grant an additional 5 attack and defense, and then Spy Song Bow will grant another 6 to all. which means it can get upwards to 34 before any blessings, before any support. It's a really solid investment that you can do because Nina becomes relatively tanky on both ends. However, one thing I forgot to mention about her bow is the condition. It's essentially if you have 2 allies that are supported within 3 spaces, she gets all these effects. This does not include her, however, it has to be 2 separate allies. The other thing worth mentioning is that because it requires allies within 3 spaces, which is relatively flexible, it's actually really flexible, so it should be really easy to complete. You will have more of a hard time running something like Male Corrin as support if you need to get her within 3 spaces of allies. Albeit you can still do it, but generally speaking you'll want to pair up your allies so Nina can work off of that. However, what makes this great is that it's just a non-condition because once you support, that's the condition, as long as you're within 3 spaces, which is really strong. The other thing too is that because this is Astra, you won't be able to take on dragons with something like Close Foil. You don't necessarily need Close Counter for something like Saros anyway. Because of the fact that Nina has a lot of resistance, she should be able to bypass most of Dragon Wall's effect, if not all of it, because of her high resistance stat, along with Spy Song Bow. Which means that combined with also no follow-up means Nina should be able to take care of Saros relatively easily. And if you want to run something more offensive instead of Iceberg, you could probably go with something like Ruptured Sky if you're really afraid of Saros. And granted, because of the fact that she does have Slaying, she can proc at every combat as long as she doubles. And then for more general PvE builds, we have 2 builds ready for her. Both builds are going to be taking advantage of her preferred weapon because it is really that good. Iceberg, Close Counter, Lull Speed Defense, Joint Drive Attack, and Mystic Boost. Because this is general PvE, you're going to be running into a lot more dragons, so you'll want something that can counter at both ranges. However, the thing about dragons is that if the foe is ranged, then they'll target the lower of the defense or res, which is why we have Mystic Boost as her seal. And it may seem kind of weird to have healing in her weapon during combat and then healing after combat, but the Mystic Boost effect will disable dragons' adaptive damage, so they'll always target her res stat, which means she can take on dragons even more. The only thing you'll have to worry about more often now than ever is melee units, because of the fact that you can't make use of blessings in PvE. However, because she has relatively good stats, she should be able to take care of a lot of PvE with no problem whatsoever. Iceberg is still there because she can double relatively easily, especially with low speed defense, meaning she could proc Iceberg in every combat as long as the foe initiates combat or the foe can counterattack. However, if you want to replace Iceberg with something like Moonbow, then you can always do that if you always want to proc Moonbow or special. And then in a similar sense, we have Spy Song Bow with Glimmer, Deathblow 4, Wind Sweep, Times Pulse, and Swift Sparrow as her seal. This is a simple build that is actually relatively effective and will take good advantage of her speed stat. Because she doesn't have no follow-up, she's only going to be attacking once with Spy Song Bow with Wind Sweep. However, this is perfectly fine because of her Slaying. The Slaying in her bow allows her to have 2 cooldown specials ready and active all the time with Times Pulse, meaning if you want to try one-shot builds, you can run Wind Sweep with skills that increase her attack. The reason we have Swift Sparrow is because we just want to be a bit more safe on that end, even though she gets an additional 6 from her weapon. But simple enough, yet it works relatively well. You can do something like this on Young Innes as well because he has the Deadeye effect, and generally speaking it's better on him because he has the Deadeye effect. However, because Nina has really high res and speed, most damage reduction skills aren't going to be active around her. The only ones in question that will be are Brave Dimitri, but he's also kind of rare, and you could just Wind Sweep him. And then finally we have 2 arena builds. The first one is just going to be for a high scoring. This one includes Spy Song Bow, Deadeye. The reason we only have colorless dual infantry 3 here is because the 4th one is not out at the time of this recording. We have Special Spiral, Times Pulse, and Quicken Pulse. This is just more so for Deadeye spam, which can be really good on Nina because of the Slang and the extra stats she gets. Times Pulse will reduce it to 1, and then Quicken Pulse will make it active, which means she can always have Deadeye ready to go. And the thing is that you don't necessarily need to worry about something like Pulse Smoke because that's more of an Aether Raids oriented skill. So more often than not, you can always spam Deadeye in her combats, which can be really good for taking on a lot of units. A bit expensive, but it's simple enough to where you can have instant Deadeyes on every combat, which is really, really strong. And then the other build is just going to be general arena assault checking. We have Spy Song Bow with Iceberg, Sturdy Impact, Null Follow-Up, Rouse Attack Defense, and Attack Speed Solo. This is just to help get her relatively low defense up. Because we have Rouse Attack Defense, Sturdy Impact, and Spy Song Bow, her defense that started at a measly 23 can go upwards to 45, I believe, which means she's more than able to take on strong armors, such as Brave Edelgard, and even the new Hegemon Edelgard, especially with Null Follow-Up. The only thing you will have to be worried about is something that either slows the cooldown of Iceberg or one-shots, because those can still happen even with stacking all this defense. Her HP stat is relatively low, so it's always something you have to watch out for. And then with that about covers Nina. I think Nina is a really, really strong unit. I just think the problem is that because she's not easily available, people are not going to be considering it, and that's totally fair, because Nina takes a lot more orbs than someone like Norn does. But in any case, she's still really, really strong. But what do you think? Let me know down below. I like to hear what you have to say. And until next time, thanks for watching.